the Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Futures Research Institute at Griffith University. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. So can you first of all explain what is a wet market?
Morning, Pete. Well, I think I must firstly say that I'm as angry as I'm sure everyone else is about the situation and the extreme measures that we have to take to control this pandemic. And obviously, I want it to be solved, and I want to make sure we take all the steps that we can to make sure this does not happen again. But I'm not sure calling for a shutdown of all wet markets is going to get us there. So onto your question, what is a wet market? Wet markets are complex and hard to understand. A wet market is a market that sells fresh produce, so animals, other produce, and we need to be clear about where the real public health risks lie and focusing on those rather than calling for blanket shutdowns, which may actually lead to perverse outcomes.
Well, I mean, I'm hearing sort of different things. I mean, there are claims that wet markets are basically all markets everywhere, and the wet relates to the ice that turns into water after it melts, and then the floors become wet. But other people are saying, well, no, it relates to markets that sell live animals and exotic animals and where animals are killed, and the wet comes from the water that it's used to wash the blood away from the floor. So what is the correct definition?
The correct definition, this is the complexity of this. I think when people are calling for shutdowns of wet markets, people are calling for shutdowns of all wildlife trade. My focus of work over the past decade has been on the regulation and management of the wildlife trade, and it's complex.
Yeah.
And there's lots of intricacies. So to call for a shutdown of wet markets is very understandable. People are feeling raw, people are feeling angry, but that's probably not going to get us into a situation where we avoid this type of risk in the future. So we need a clear understanding of which species and where the risk lies, and we need to work together with different authorities and, importantly, the people affected by the closure of these markets and the millions of livelihoods supported by these markets to ensure that we can manage them and regulate them in a good way, and then critically, of course, shut down the ones that we need to shut down and close off trading species such as, for example, or animals such as bats, where there's really high risk.
Yeah, I mean, these wet markets are prevalent. They're not just in China, right? So would you support regulation, right across the world when it comes to the selling of these exotic animals, selling bats in markets, which, most of us would find pretty unusual over here?
Absolutely, yes. Well, I was in Denmark last year visiting a friend, and I visited a wet market, and that was well managed and seemed very healthy. So yes, absolutely. And as various calls have been made, this is an international challenge. There are wet markets in where I come from in Africa, and often they provide a direct link between farmers and between low-income consumers. And often local people feel that the produce that they can buy directly is safer than what they could perhaps buy from supermarkets where they're not sure of the health standards.
Okay, all right.
And so, yes, we need to work together to really carefully understand those markets and regulate them, and importantly, manage and enforce against some of the dangerous practices that have led to our current situation.